The old man stood at the entrance of La Maison Rouge, his worn service cap clutched between calloused hands, while the maitre d' eyed his faded jacket with unconcealed disdain. "Sir, we require proper attire and reservations," the host sneered, loud enough for nearby diners to hear, causing several to turn their heads toward the weathered veteran who had earned his limp on the blood-soaked shores of Normandy. From her table by the window, Catherine Montgomery, one of the city's wealthiest socialites, watched the scene unfold, her diamond-adorned fingers tightening around her crystal wineglass as memories of her late father, a decorated war hero, flooded her mind. The veteran turned to leave, shoulders slumped in quiet dignity, when Catherine's voice cut through the murmuring restaurant like a silver bell. But what happened next would change not just that evening, but the lives of everyone in that restaurant. Forever. What dark secret did this forgotten hero carry that would leave Catherine Montgomery in tears by dessert? Subscribe to Talus Strength for more stories that remind us that honor and dignity still exist in this world. Catherine Montgomery hadn't planned on making a scene that evening. The finest restaurant in the city had been her sanctuary for quiet dinners, a place where she could escape the pressures of running her family's charitable foundation. But something, in the veteran's eyes, a familiar dignity she'd seen in her father's photographs, struck a chord deep within her soul. "Jacques," she called out to the maitre d', her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "That gentleman will be dining with me this evening." The crystal stemware trembled slightly as she set down her wineglass, her mother's etiquette lessons warring with her sense of justice. The maitre d' froze, his practiced smile faltering. "But Madame Montgomery, surely you understand." "What?" "I understand," Catherine interrupted, rising from her chair with deliberate grace, "is that man wore a uniform that gave you the freedom to stand here and judge him." The pearls at her neck caught the light as she crossed the dining room, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady rhythm. The veteran had already turned toward the door, his weathered hands gripping his service cap so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Catherine noticed how he favored his left leg, the same way her father had in his final years. "Sir," she said, softer now, reaching his side, "would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner?" Up close she could see the careful pressing of his worn jacket, the neat trim of his silver hair. This was a man who took pride in his appearance, despite limited means. He turned, and Catherine found herself looking into eyes that had seen too much. "Ma'am, I appreciate your kindness, but I wouldn't want to impose." His voice carried the gravelly weight of age, but beneath it lay the crisp enunciation of military bearing. "Please," she said, gesturing to her table. "I insist. My father was a veteran, and he taught me that sharing a meal with a soldier is always an honor." She watched as something flickered across his face, recognition perhaps, or shared understanding. The other diners had fallen silent, their attention caught between their expensive meals and the unfolding drama. A young couple at a nearby table whispered behind their menus, while an elderly gentleman in a business suit watched with obvious disapproval. "My name is Catherine Montgomery," she offered, extending her hand. The veteran straightened, almost imperceptibly at her name, a subtle shift that didn't escape her notice. "James Harrison, ma'am, Sergeant, United States Army." He took her hand with gentle respect, and Catherine felt the roughness of decades of hard work in his palm. As they walked back to her table, Catherine was acutely aware of the contrast they presented, her designer dress and his worn clothes, her ease in these surroundings and his careful, measured steps. But there was something in his bearing that commanded more respect than all the wealthy patrons combined. Jacques hurried forward, nearly tripping over himself to pull out a chair for James. The maitre d's earlier disdain had transformed into a nervous attentiveness, though his eyes still held a shadow of disapproval. "Would monsieur care for a drink?" Jacques asked, his French accent notably thicker than it had been moments before. James glanced at the elaborate wine list and shook his head slightly. "Water will be fine. Thank you." His hands came to rest on the crisp white tablecloth, and Catherine noticed a slight tremor, age, perhaps, or something more. James Harrison sat with military precision, his posture a stark contrast to the relaxed affluence surrounding them. The fine china before him reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, creating tiny points of light that reminded him of stars. Over the French countryside, back when the world was fire and shadow, and every moment might be his last. "You mentioned your father was a veteran," James said carefully, his eyes studying Catherine's face with quiet intensity. "May I ask which unit?" Catherine smiled, a touch of sadness softening her elegant features. "The 116th Infantry Regiment. He was at Normandy." She paused, watching as James's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his water glass. "Colonel Thomas Montgomery." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. James's weathered face remained composed, but something flickered behind his eyes, a shadow of memory perhaps, or a ghost of pain long buried. "Your father was a good man," he said finally, each word measured and precise. "A brave man." Catherine leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued by the personal note in his voice. "Did you know him?" Before James could answer, a waiter appeared with menus, his practiced smile faltering slightly as he took in James's attire. "Our chef's tasting menu this evening features a delicate sole meunière, followed by—" "Perhaps," Catherine interrupted, gently, "we could start with something simpler." She turned to James. "The steak here is excellent, cooked to perfection." James nodded, grateful for her understanding. "That would be fine, thank you." His words carried the weight of someone unused to such settings, but determined to maintain dignity. As the waiter departed, Catherine noticed James's eyes drift to a small group of younger diners at a nearby table, their laughter carrying across the restaurant as they snapped photos of their elaborate dishes with expensive phones. She recognized the look in his eyes, not envy, but something closer to resignation, the quiet acknowledgement of a world that had moved on without him. "I come here often," Catherine said, drawing his attention back, "but sometimes I wonder if we've lost something in all this elegance. My father used to tell stories about sharing K rations with his men, how those were some of the best meals of his life." James's face softened slightly. "Your father understood what many don't, that it's not about the food, it's about the company you keep." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his chest, where Catherine caught a glimpse of something metallic beneath his jacket. "The best meal I ever had was a can of cold beans shared with your father on a moonless night in France." Catherine's breath caught. "Then you did serve with him?" "Ma'am, there are some stories," James began but stopped. As their steaks arrived, the plates arranged with artistic precision. The interruption seemed to close whatever window had briefly opened, and James turned his attention to cutting his meat with careful, deliberate movements. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of servers and sommeliers of crystal, touching crystal and muted conversations. But Catherine sensed they sat in their own pocket of time, where the present was thin ice over deep waters of memory. A young woman at the next table glanced their way and whispered something to her companion, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Catherine noticed James's shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly, his military bearing becoming more pronounced, armor against judgment, dignity in the face of disdain. "You know," Catherine said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough, "my father always said you could tell the measure of a person by how they treat others." She met the young woman's eyes until she looked away, a flush rising to her cheeks. The steak before James was cooked to perfection, but his movements remained measured and precise as he ate. Each gesture spoke of ingrained military discipline, the way he held his fork, how he dabbed his mouth with the napkin, the careful rhythm of his dining. Catherine recognized these mannerisms from countless dinners with her father, where even years after the war, he treated every meal as if a drill sergeant might inspect his table manners. "You don't need to be quite so formal," Catherine said, gently, noticing how he waited for her to take a bite before continuing with his own meal. "Oh, this isn't the officer's mess." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. "Old habits, ma'am. Though I was never an officer myself, some things they teach you just stick with you, whether you want them to or not." Catherine noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. The tremors weren't the natural shake of age. They had a different quality to them, one she'd seen before in her father's hands during thunderstorms or when fireworks exploded on the 4th of July. "It's Mary's birthday today," James said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife. She always wanted to dine here, but we could never afford it. I thought maybe just once." His voice trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging heavy in the air. Catherine felt her throat tighten. "Is she—" "3 years ago," James replied, his eyes focused on some distant point. "Cancer. She made me promise to keep living, to keep trying new things. 'Don't let the world pass you by,' she'd say." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She was always pushing me to step outside my comfort zone." A server appeared, offering fresh ground pepper with the practiced flourish of fine dining. James politely declined, his discomfort with the attention evident in the set of his shoulders. The young server lingered a moment too long, his curious gaze taking in James's worn jacket and the visible gap between him and the restaurant's usual clientele. Catherine noticed how the other diners would glance their way when they thought no one was watching, their expressions a mix of curiosity and dismissal. The maître d' kept finding reasons to patrol nearby, as if their table might somehow disturb the restaurant's carefully cultivated atmosphere. "Your father," James said, changing the subject with military efficiency, "he used to carry a photograph of you in his breast pocket. Showed it to anyone who'd look. 'My little girl,' he'd say. Smarter than any officer in the regiment." The memory seemed to surprise him, as if it had surfaced unbidden from deep waters. Catherine's hand went to her throat, fingers brushing against her pearls. "I never knew that. He was right about you being smart," James continued, his voice warming slightly. "Standing up for an old soldier like me. Not many would do that these days. Not many would understand what it means to serve," Catherine replied, thinking of her father's quiet pride, his reluctance to speak of his experiences, except in the most general terms. "To sacrifice." James's hand moved unconsciously to his chest again, and Catherine caught another glimpse of metal beneath his jacket. The movement drew a few more stares from nearby tables, where younger diners were more interested in photographing their elaborate desserts than noticing the history sitting in their midst. "Your father understood sacrifice," James said quietly, his words nearly lost in the gentle clinking of fine china and crystal. "Better than most." A waiter approached with the dessert menu, but Catherine waved him away, sensing that James had more to say. The tremor in his hands had intensified, and she noticed how he gripped his water glass a little tighter, as if anchoring himself to the present. "There was a night," he began, then stopped, looking around at the elegant dining room with its soft lighting and expensive artwork. But perhaps this isn't the place for old war stories." "Every place is the right place for truth," Catherine said, echoing words her father had often used. The phrase seemed to strike something in James, and she watched as his military bearing softened just slightly, like a fortress lowering its drawbridge. James reached into his worn jacket, movements deliberate and careful, as if handling something precious. From an inner pocket he withdrew a leather wallet, its surface cracked and smoothed by decades of use. Catherine watched as his weathered fingers, still steady despite their earlier tremors, opened it to reveal a photograph protected by a yellowing plastic sleeve. "Mary," he said simply, turning the wallet so Catherine could see. The photograph showed a young woman in a white dress, her smile radiant against a backdrop of summer flowers. "Our wedding day, 1955. She waited for me, 3 years while I was overseas, then another 2 while I tried to put myself back together." Catherine leaned forward to study the image, noting the simple beauty of the bride and the joy evident in her pose. "She's lovely," she said softly. She saved me, James continued, his voice taking on a quality Catherine recognized. The same tone her father used when speaking of the men who died under his command. After the war, I wasn't who I'd been before. Mary, she had this way about her. Patient, kind, but tough when she needed to be. A busboy clearing a nearby table dropped a fork, the clatter of metal on marble startlingly loud in the quiet restaurant. James's reaction was subtle, but immediate, his posture stiffening, eyes scanning the room with military precision before forcing himself to relax. The doctors called it shell shock back then, he said, his words barely audible. These days, they have fancier names for it. Mary, she didn't care what they called it. She'd just hold my hand during the thunderstorms, talk me through the bad nights. Catherine noticed other diners trying to eavesdrop now, their own conversations falling quiet as they strained to hear. The young couple who had whispered earlier had set down their phones, their faces showing the first hints of understanding. She sounds like an extraordinary woman, Catherine said, thinking of her own mother, who had handled her father's nightmares with similar grace. James's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. She made me promise to keep her photo in my wallet. Said, as long as I carried it, I'd never really be alone. He paused, and Catherine saw something shift in his expression. Your father, he understood about promises, about carrying things. The maître d' approached their table again, presumably to ask about dessert, but Catherine silently waved him away. She could sense they were approaching something important, something that had waited decades to be spoken. Did you know, James, said, carefully returning the wallet to his pocket, that your father carried something too, not just your picture? His hand moved to his chest again, to that hidden glint of metal Catherine had noticed earlier. Around them, the restaurant's elegant atmosphere seemed to fade, as if the present moment was being gently pushed aside by the weight of memory. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast gentle shadows that reminded Catherine of how her father would sit in his study late at night, the lamplight creating similar patterns as he stared at nothing, lost in thoughts he never shared. What did he carry? Catherine asked, though something in her heart already knew the answer would change everything she thought she knew about her father. James's fingers worked at his jacket button, his movements slow and deliberate. Your father once told me that some burdens are too heavy for one man to carry alone. The button came free, and James reached inside his jacket toward whatever had been catching the light throughout their meal. From beneath his jacket, James withdrew a silver chain, and with it came a distinguished service cross that caught the restaurant's soft lighting. The metal swayed gently, its surface marked with a patina of years, but still unmistakably prestigious. Catherine's breath caught. She'd seen one exactly like it among her father's effects after his passing. Your father recommended me for this, James said quietly, letting the metal rest in his palm. But it wasn't his only connection to it. His eyes met Catherine's, carrying the weight of a story decades in the telling. He had one too, didn't he? Catherine nodded slowly, her throat tight. He never talked about how he earned it. When I asked, he'd just say there were some stories better left in France. That sounds like Tom, James said, using her father's first name for the first time. He never could take credit for his own heroism, always deflected to others, talked about his men instead of himself. He paused, running a thumb over the medals. Surface. But I was there the night he earned his, just like he was there the night I earned mine. A server approaching their table stopped short, sensing the gravity of the moment. Other diners had grown quiet, the usual restaurant chatter fading to a respectful hush. Even the young couple who had been sneering earlier were now listening intently, their desserts forgotten. It was July 1944, James continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. We'd been pushing inland from the coast, trying to secure a position near St. Lo. Your father was a captain then, leading a company through some of the worst fighting I'd ever seen. Catherine leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. This was the story her father had never told, the weight he'd carried silently all those years. The Germans had been shelling us for hours. The hedgerows, they were like a maze, each one potentially hiding an enemy position. we'd lost our radio operator, and half the company was either wounded or separated. James's hands had steadied, now as if the act of remembering had anchored him. Your father had taken a bullet in his leg early in the fight, but he refused evacuation. Not while my men are still out there, he kept saying. The maitre d' had drifted closer, all his earlier disdain replaced by rapt attention. James either didn't notice or didn't care, lost in the memories he was finally sharing. We were pinned down behind one of those hedgerows when we heard it. American voices calling for help. Turned out a platoon had gotten cut off. Trapped in a farmhouse about 200 yards ahead. The German artillery had started a fire, and those boys were going to either burn alive or have to run straight into enemy fire. Catherine could see it in her mind. Her father, younger than she'd ever known him, wounded, but refusing to leave his men. The image brought tears to her eyes. Your father organized a rescue mission, voluntary only. He wouldn't order anyone into that hell. I was one of 12 who stepped forward. James's voice grew softer, forcing everyone to lean in slightly to hear. He led us himself, limping the whole way, using the smoke from the burning farmhouse as cover. We lost 3 men getting there, but we reached that platoon. A wine glass clinked somewhere in the restaurant, the sound sharp against the silence. James startled slightly but continued, his eyes focused on something only he could see. But getting there was only half the battle. We had 30 men to evacuate now, several of them wounded, and the Germans knew exactly where we were. That's when your father made his decision. James looked directly at Catherine. He said he'd provide covering fire while we got the men out. Alone. But you didn't let him, Catherine whispered, somehow knowing what came next. James shook his head slowly. No, ma'am, I couldn't. I told him I'd stay too. He argued, ordered me to go actually, but some orders you just can't follow, not when you know they're wrong. The Distinguished Service Cross caught another glint of light as James carefully tucked it back beneath his jacket. His movements were precise, practiced, the same way Catherine had watched her father handle his own medal on the rare occasions. He'd taken it out. 2 men with 2 rifles, James continued, his voice carrying the weight of that long-ago night. Your father positioned himself at one window, me at another. We had maybe 6 magazines between us and a couple of grenades. The Germans were getting closer. We could hear them speaking. A waiter nearly dropped a tray of glasses at a nearby table, the sound making several diners jump. But James remained steady now, as if the act of telling the story had transported him back to that moment when everything hung in the balance. Your father started singing, James said, a faint smile touching his lips. Right there, with death closing in. The army goes rolling along, caught me completely off guard. But then I realized what he was doing, using the sound to help guide our men through the smoke, letting them know we were still there. Catherine pressed her hand to her mouth, tears threatening to spill. She'd heard her father humming that song countless times during her childhood, never knowing its significance. We held that position for 45 minutes. Felt like 45 years. The Germans tried rushing us twice. Bad idea. Your father may have been wounded, but his aim was true. When we ran low on ammunition, we started throwing pieces of the burning building at them. Anything to buy more time. The restaurant had grown so quiet that the sound of James's water glass touching the table seemed thunderous. Even the kitchen staff had emerged, standing in doorways to listen. Then we heard it. American artillery starting up behind us. The Germans must have heard it too because they pulled back. But the shells were going to rain down on our position too. We had maybe 2 minutes to get out. James paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his left side. That's when the last German attack came. One soldier, probably just a kid, got lucky with a grenade throw. A woman at a nearby table gasped softly. The maitre d' had given up any pretense of working, standing, stock still with a bottle of wine forgotten in his hands. Your father saw it coming. He shouted a warning, but I was focused on another target. Next thing I knew, he'd tackled me. The grenade went off, caught him in the leg again, got me in the side. But we were alive. James's voice grew hoarse. He was bleeding badly, couldn't walk. I told him I'd carry him out. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Like hell you will, Sergeant. That's an order." Catherine could picture it clearly, her father's stubborn determination, the same. Look, he'd worn every time she'd tried to help him in his later years when his war wounds troubled him. He pulled his dog tags off, pressed them into my hand, along with a letter for your mother. Said if one of us was going to make it, it had to be me. I was younger, faster, had a better chance. Then he pulled his sidearm, said he'd cover my retreat. James stopped, taking a sip of water with a slightly shaking hand. I refused, of course. Told him if he was staying, I was staying. That's when he played his last card. The tension in the restaurant was palpable. A young busboy had stopped clearing tables, clutching a dirty plate to his chest like a shield. He said, "Harrison, I've got a little girl waiting for me at home, but if I don't make it, I need someone to tell her how her daddy died. You're the only one who'll know the truth." Then he smiled, actually smiled, and said, "That's not an order, Sergeant. That's a request from a father." James fell silent for a moment, his eyes meeting Catherine's across the table. She could see the cost. Of each word, the weight of a promise kept for decades. "What did you do?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. "The only thing I could do," James replied softly. I looked him in the eye, said, "Yes, sir," and started crawling through the smoke. His covering fire followed me the whole way, keeping the Germans' heads down. Just before I made it to our lines, I heard him start singing again. Catherine sat perfectly still, her mother's lessons in composure warring with the storm of emotions inside her. Around them, the restaurant's elegant atmosphere had transformed. No longer was James the out-of-place veteran in worn clothes, but rather the keeper of a sacred history that held everyone spellbound. "But he survived," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He came home." James nodded slowly. By some miracle, the artillery barrage shifted at the last moment. A medical unit found him at dawn, still at his position, empty pistol in his hand. They said he'd used his belt as a tourniquet, kept fighting even after losing so much blood most men would have been unconscious. The maitre d' silently placed a fresh glass of water near James's elbow, his earlier condescension replaced by something approaching reverence. James acknowledged him with a slight nod, the gesture carrying decades of military courtesy. They sent him to a field hospital, then back to England. Took him 6 months to recover enough to walk again. By the time he returned to the unit, I was back too, though it was a while before they let me do more than clerical work. James gestured vaguely toward his side where the grenade had caught him. "That's why he limped," Catherine said, memories of her childhood suddenly shifting into sharper focus. "All those years he told us it was an old football injury. He never wanted us to worry." "Your father believed in protecting people from painful truths," James replied. "Sometimes too much, if you ask me. But that was his way, carrying burdens, so others wouldn't have to." A young woman at the next table wiped tears from her cheeks, no longer pretending not to listen. Her companion, who had earlier smirked at James' appearance, sat with his head bowed, shame evident in his posture. "After the war," James continued, "we stayed in touch for a while, Christmas cards mostly. He'd write about you, how proud he was of your grades, your piano recitals. Then one year the cards stopped coming. I read about his passing in the Army newsletter." Catherine remembered that time, her father's final years, when the old wound seemed to plague him more than ever. The doctors said it was his heart, but sometimes I wondered if it was the memories that finally wore him down. "Could have been both," James said quietly. "War leaves marks that don't show up on x-rays. Your father carried more than just physical scars." The restaurant's background music had been silenced at some point, leaving only the soft clink of cutlery and hushed conversations. Through the windows, the city's evening lights created a gentle glow, as if the present moment was being cushioned from the harsh realities of the memories being shared. "After Mary passed," James said, his voice growing rougher, "I started thinking more about promises, the ones we keep, the ones we can't. Your father made me promise to tell you the truth someday. But how do you walk up to someone's door 30 years later and say, 'Let me tell you about the night your father saved my life'?" I Server approached with dessert menus, saw the tears in Catherine's eyes, and quietly retreated. The young couple who had been whispering earlier now sat in respectful silence, their phones forgotten on the table. So I carried his story along with this. James touched his chest where the medal lay hidden. Figured maybe fate would provide an opportunity. Mary always said things happen when they're supposed to, not when we plan them. Catherine reached across the table, gently placing her hand over his weathered one. She was right, and my father was right too, about you being the one to tell the story. No one else could have done it justice. James turned his hand over to briefly squeeze hers, the gesture containing volumes of unspoken understanding. Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, but not just because of what he did in combat. It was the way he lived afterward, carrying his wounds with dignity, raising his family with love, never letting the darkness of what he'd seen dim the light he shared with others. The truth, once started, seemed to flow from James like a river breaking through a long-standing dam. His posture had changed, the weight of decades of silence lifting from his shoulders as he continued to share the story he'd carried for so long. There's something else you should know, he said, reaching into his jacket again. This time he withdrew a carefully preserved envelope, its corners soft with age. Your father gave me this the night we parted in France, asked me to keep it safe, return it to him if we both made it. If not, he slid the envelope across the table toward Catherine. It was meant for you. Catherine's hands trembled as she took the envelope. The paper was yellowed, but she could still make out her father's distinctive handwriting. For Catherine, if I don't make it home. The seal was unbroken. He never asked for it back, James explained softly. When we met, after the war, he just said, keep it, Harrison. Someday she might need to know. I've carried it ever since. The restaurant had grown so quiet that the sound of Catherine breaking the seal seemed impossibly loud. The letter inside was written on army stationery. The ink faded, but still legible. Several diners openly wiped away tears as she began to read aloud. My dearest Catherine, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. I'm writing this from a farmhouse in France, with shells falling nearby and a good man named James Harrison watching my back. You're only 7 years old tonight, probably asleep in your bed back home, safe from all of this. I want you to know that everything I've done here, every risk I've taken, has been to make sure you grow up in a world where freedom isn't just a word in a history book. Tonight, I'm trying to save 30 young men who remind me of myself when I shipped out, scared but brave, far from home, but fighting for everything that matters. If I don't make it, ask Sergeant Harrison about this night. He's the kind of man who keeps his promises, who understands that some things are worth dying for. He'll tell you the truth, all of it, when the time is right. Remember that I love you more than life itself. Remember that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting, but in how we treat others when the fighting's done. And remember that your dad died doing what he believed in, protecting those who needed protection. Be kind to your mother. Study hard, and never let anyone tell you that one person can't make a difference in this world. All my love, Dad. Catherine's voice broke on the last words. Around them, there wasn't a dry eye in the restaurant. Even the kitchen staff gathered in the doorway stood in reverent silence. He survived that night, Catherine said, carefully folding the letter. He came home. Why didn't he ever ask for this back? James's eyes held a deep understanding. I think he wanted it preserved, exactly as it was written in that moment of truth. Sometimes when we survive something we never expected to survive, our words from that time become sacred, more honest than anything we could say afterward. The maitre d' approached their table, his face solemn. Madame Montgomery, Monsieur Harrison, please. Tonight's dinner is, of course, on the house. James straightened in his chair, that military bearing returning. No, sir. I came here to pay for a proper dinner, and that's what I intend to do. He reached for his worn wallet. Catherine touched his arm gently. Please, let me, in honor of both our fathers, the hero who came home and the hero who made sure his story would be told. A young man at a nearby table suddenly stood, his dinner companion looking up in surprise. "Sir," he addressed James, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant, "my grandfather was in the 116th. He never talked about the war, but would you allow me to contribute to your dinner in his memory?" Catherine couldn't hold back her tears any longer. They fell silently, dropping onto the crisp white tablecloth like rain. The letter from her father lay before her, its aged paper containing words written in a moment when mortality felt closest. Words that had waited decades to be read. Around them, the restaurant had transformed. Other diners were standing now, one by one, approaching their table with quiet respect. An elderly woman removed a gold bracelet, her hands shaking slightly. "My Harold was in Normandy too," she said softly. "He never made it home. Would you accept this in his memory?" James started to protest, but the woman's expression stopped him. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same one he'd seen in countless windows and doorways in France, where civilians watched young soldiers march past, carrying the weight of war and sacrifice. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'd be honored, but not for myself. This belongs with others who understand its value." He turned to Catherine. "Your father's foundation, it helps veterans, doesn't it?" Catherine nodded, understanding blooming in her eyes. "Yes, but mostly with practical matters, housing, medical care, job training. Sometimes practical matters are what save us," James replied, thinking of Mary's patient help with his nightmares, how she'd pushed him to keep living when memories threatened to drag him under. Sometimes just knowing someone remembers, someone cares, is enough to keep going. More diners approached, each with something to offer. A businessman removed his expensive tie pin, explaining how his uncle had served in the Pacific. A young woman slipped off her college ring, tears in her eyes as she spoke of her brother currently serving overseas. The maitre d' disappeared into his office and returned with a bottle of wine so old its label had begun to fade. "This was saved for a special occasion," he said, his French accent thicker with emotion. "I cannot think of one more special than this." Catherine watched in wonder as the impromptu offerings accumulated on their table, each item carrying its own weight of memory and meaning. James sat perfectly straight, acknowledging each gift with the dignity of a man who understood the true cost of sacrifice. "Your father would be proud," he told Catherine quietly. "Not of the medals or the stories, but of this. People remembering, caring, sharing their own stories of service and loss." A young server, who couldn't have been more than 20, approached their table hesitantly. "Sir," he addressed James, "my family, we're from near St. Lo. My grandmother used to tell us stories about the Americans who liberated their village. She said they sang as they fought, that sometimes at night they could hear American songs through the darkness." James's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "We sang to keep our spirits up," he explained, "to remind ourselves of home, to let each other know we weren't alone." The young man swallowed hard. She said those songs gave them hope, that even in the darkest nights, hearing American voices meant morning would come again. He paused, then added in careful English, "Thank you for my grandmother's freedom." Catherine watched as James struggled to maintain his composure. This proud man, who had carried her father's story for so long, who had waited decades to fulfill a promise made in a burning French farmhouse, was finally seeing the ripples of his service spread out across generations. "Your father once told me," James said to Catherine, his voice barely above a whisper, "that the hardest part of war isn't the fighting, it's living with the memories afterward. But moments like this, they help us remember why it mattered, why it still matters." The restaurant's elegant lighting seemed to soften, creating a gentle glow around their table that felt almost sacred. The usual sounds of fine dining had been replaced by a respectful hush, broken only by quiet conversations as diners shared their own family histories of service and sacrifice. Word spread quickly through the restaurant staff, then out into the street. A local news reporter, finishing her dinner at the bar, had quietly made a few calls. By the time the main courses were being cleared, the first veterans began arriving. They came individually at first, an older man in a VFW cap, a middle-aged woman wearing her service pins, a young Marine in his dress blues who had been dining nearby. They gathered respectfully at the edges of the dining room, drawn by the story. That was spreading through whispered conversations and hastily shared text messages. The maitre d', who hours earlier had tried to turn James away, now efficiently arranged for additional chairs, creating an impromptu gathering space around Catherine and James's table. "Sir," the young Marine approached, standing at perfect attention. "Permission to join you?" James straightened instinctively, years falling away from his bearing. "Granted, son. Pull up a chair." The Marine's eyes fell to the distinguished service cross, now visible beneath James's jacket. "That's from Normandy, sir?" "It is," James replied, his voice carrying a weight that made the young man lean forward slightly. "Though there are plenty of heroes who never got medals. Your grandfather might have been one of them." The Marine nodded solemnly. "Afghanistan for me, sir. Different war, different place, but—" He paused, searching for words. "Some things don't change, do they? The way we look out for each other. The promises we make." Catherine watched as James's expression softened with understanding. "No, son, those things never change." More veterans arrived, each carrying their own stories. A Vietnam helicopter pilot spoke quietly about moonless nights and desperate evacuations. A Desert Storm sergeant shared memories of sandstorms and brotherhood. Their stories began to blend with James's, creating a tapestry of service that spanned generations. The restaurant's owner emerged from his office, his face etched with emotion. "My father," he announced to the gathered crowd, "served with the French Resistance. He too had a story about American soldiers, men who shared their rations with hungry children, who gave hope when hope seemed lost." He turned to James. "From this day forward, no veteran will ever be turned away from my restaurant. This I swear on my father's memory." Applause rippled through the dining room, but James raised his hand for quiet. "Sir," he addressed the owner, "that's a generous offer, but perhaps instead—" He glanced at Catherine, who nodded in understanding. "What if," Catherine continued, standing to address the room, "we did something more? My father's foundation has always focused on practical help for veterans, but tonight has shown me that there's another need, a place for stories to be told, for memories to be shared, for sacrifices to be honored." The young couple who had initially scorned James now stood. "My company," the man said, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility, "specializes in digital archiving. We could help record these stories, create a living history." A retired teacher in the crowd raised her hand. "I could coordinate with local schools, bring students to hear these testimonies firsthand." The energy in the room shifted, ideas and offers flowing freely. The reporter who had made the initial calls was now openly taking notes, her eyes bright with the recognition of a story that transcended the usual news cycle. James sat quietly, at the center of it all, his weathered hands resting on the table near his empty plate. Catherine noticed how he watched the younger veterans especially, seeing in their faces perhaps a reflection of himself and her father in those distant days of war. "Your father would have liked this," he said softly to Catherine. "Not the attention, he never cared for that, but the connections being made, the stories being shared. He always said the greatest tragedy of war wasn't just the lives lost, but the stories that died with each soldier who couldn't tell them." A local choir director, dining with his family, approached the table. "Sir," he addressed James, "would it be appropriate? Would you allow us to sing something? The Army song you mentioned earlier, perhaps?" James glanced around the room at the faces of veterans young and old, at civilians learning to understand the weight of service and sacrifice. Then he nodded, slowly rising to his feet. Other veterans stood as well, some quickly, others with the careful movements of age or injury. The first notes of "The Army Goes Rolling Along" rose tentatively at first, then gained strength as more voices joined in. James stood at attention, his posture perfect despite his years, as the song his friend had used to guide men through smoke and fire now filled the elegant dining room. Veterans from different eras and branches of service stood together, some singing, others standing in respectful silence. Catherine watched as the song transformed the space. The crystal chandeliers and fine china seemed to fade into the background as something more profound took center stage, a moment of shared understanding that transcended the usual barriers of class and circumstance that had initially made James seem so out of place. When the last notes faded, a World War II veteran in his 90s, who had been wheeled in by his grandson, raised his trembling hand. "I was there too," he said, his voice thin but clear. "Omaha Beach. Different sector than you boys, but I remember the hedgerows, remember the singing." James made his way to the elderly veteran's side, each step measured and respectful. The two men looked at each other with the deep understanding that only those who have shared such experiences can know. "2nd Infantry Division," the older man said, touching his unit pin. "116th Infantry Regiment," James replied softly. "Different paths to the same hell," the older veteran nodded. "Lost my best friend in those hedgerows. Never got to tell his family how brave he was in those final moments." James placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "Tell us now," he said. It's time these stories were heard. The restaurant staff, moving with quiet efficiency, began arranging chairs in a semicircle. The reporter had called in a photographer who captured images with careful discretion, understanding the sacred nature of what was unfolding. The elderly veteran's story spilled out, a tale of friendship forged in training camps, tested in combat, and ended on a sunny French morning. His grandson, hearing these details for the first time, wiped tears from his eyes as he learned how his grandfather had earned his Silver Star trying to save his friend. Other veterans began sharing their stories. A Korean War survivor spoke of frozen nights and unimaginable courage. A nurse who had served in Vietnam described the strength she found in caring for the wounded and dying. Each story was different, yet connected by threads of sacrifice, loyalty, and the weight of memories carried for decades. The young Marine who had joined them earlier stood to share his own experience of modern warfare, of high-tech battles that still came down to human courage and cost. His words built a bridge across generations, showing how the core of service remained unchanged despite the evolution of weapons and tactics. Catherine, listening to these interwoven narratives, suddenly understood something about her father that had eluded her all her life. "They're not just stories, are they?" she said quietly to James. "They're pieces of a larger truth about what it means to serve, to sacrifice, to carry on afterward." James nodded slowly. "Your father understood that. It's why he wanted his story preserved, but not just as a tale of individual heroism. He knew that every soldier's story is part of something bigger, a tapestry of courage and sacrifice that needs to be remembered, not just in history books, but in the hearts of those who come after." The restaurant owner had begun serving coffee and dessert to everyone gathered, refusing any payment. "In my father's resistance days," he explained, "they would gather in secret to share information, to keep hope alive. Tonight, we gather to keep memories alive, to ensure sacrifices are not forgotten." A local historian who had been dining at the restaurant earlier was now taking careful notes, her professional detachment occasionally breaking as particularly moving details emerged. "These stories," she said during a quiet moment, "they're not just military history, they're human history, the kind that too often slips away because we don't make time to listen, to remember." The news of what was happening at La Maison Rouge spread through social media like wildfire. The reporter's initial tweets had been shared thousands of times, drawing more people to the restaurant's doors. Veterans organizations began reaching out, and local TV stations sent crews to capture what was becoming a spontaneous gathering of generations united by service and sacrifice. Catherine watched in amazement as her phone lit up with notifications. Board members from her father's foundation were calling, eager to support whatever initiative might grow from this evening. But it was the text messages from her mother that touched her most deeply. "Your father would be so proud," her mother wrote. "He always said James Harrison was the bravest man he knew. Now I understand why he kept that story close to his heart." The maître d', Jacques, who had transformed from a guardian of exclusivity to a humble facilitator of history, approached their table with a leather-bound book, the restaurant's guest book, reserved for special occasions. "Monsieur Harrison," he said, his earlier pretension replaced by genuine respect. "Would you do us the honor? Perhaps you could write something about tonight, about Colonel Montgomery?" James looked at the book thoughtfully, then took the offered pen. His handwriting, like everything else about him, was precise and measured. On a night in France, 1944, Colonel Thomas Montgomery taught me that courage isn't about medals or glory. It's about choosing to stand firm when standing firm might cost everything. Tonight, decades later, his daughter Catherine showed me that his legacy lives on in acts of kindness and moments of understanding to all who serve, who have served, who wait at home, who remember. Your stories matter. They are the threads that bind us across time, across battlefields, across generations. As he wrote the final words, a young woman in Air Force dress blues approached the table. She had arrived minutes earlier, still carrying her deployment bag. "I just returned from overseas," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "My Uber driver showed me the social media posts. I couldn't not come. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the hedgerows in France, about men like you who showed us what real courage means." The restaurant owner, who had been coordinating with his staff to accommodate the growing crowd, made an announcement that brought tears to many eyes. From this night forward, the private dining room will be renamed the Veterans Room. Its walls will display the photographs and stories of those who served, beginning with Colonel Montgomery and Sergeant Harrison's story of that night in France. A local artist, moved by the evening's events, had begun sketching on his tablet. On the screen, rough lines captured James and Catherine at their table, the Distinguished Service Cross visible, while around them the ghostly figures of young soldiers emerged from the background, a visual representation of how the past was bleeding into the present. "We could project stories like these onto the walls," the digital artist suggested, showing his sketch to the gathering. "Create a living memorial that changes, grows, keeps these memories alive." The young couple who had initially judged James by his appearance had become some of the evening's most enthusiastic supporters. The man, a software developer, was already creating a prototype app to collect and preserve veteran stories. His partner, a social media manager, was helping to organize the flood of responses pouring in from across the country. "It's not just about the past," she explained to Catherine. "It's about creating connections. Every story shared tonight has touched someone, changed someone's perspective. That's how we fight indifference. One story, one moment of understanding at a time." James sat quietly at the center of it all, his presence a reminder of why they had gathered. Catherine noticed how he watched each interaction, each moment of connection, with the same careful attention he must have once given to battlefield. "Observations, your father once told me," he said to her softly, "that the real victory isn't just in surviving, but in making sure something good grows from the sacrifice." I didn't fully understand what he meant until tonight. The restaurant owner, Michel Laurent, stood before the gathered crowd, his usual business-like demeanor softened by emotion. "When I took over this restaurant from my father," he began, his French accent more pronounced with feeling, "he told me something I never fully understood until tonight. He said, 'A great restaurant is not just about food, it's about the stories shared across its tables.'" Michel's eyes met James's across the room. "Tonight, Sergeant Harrison came to honor a promise and a memory. He thought he would be turned away because of his clothes. Instead, he has turned our restaurant into something sacred, a place where stories of courage and sacrifice will always have a home." The owner reached into his jacket and withdrew a small tarnished medal. "This was my father's, given to him by American soldiers who helped the resistance. I've kept it in my office all these years. Now it belongs on the wall of our veterans room, alongside the story of Colonel Montgomery and Sergeant Harrison." Catherine watched as James stood, making his way to Michelle with measured steps. The two men faced each other, one in an expensive suit, the other in his worn jacket, and embraced like brothers. The gathered crowd applauded, understanding they were witnessing not just a moment of reconciliation, but a transformation. The maitre d', Jacques, stepped forward with an announcement. "Starting tomorrow, every Thursday evening will be Veterans Night at La Maison Rouge, not just for dining, but for sharing, for remembering, for honoring." A local veterans organization representative quickly added, "We'll ensure transportation for those who need it. No veteran will be turned away for lack of means." The young software developer who had been working on the story-sharing app projected his prototype onto the restaurant's wall. "We've already received hundreds of submissions," he explained, scrolling through messages from across the country. Veterans, families, civilians, all wanting to share their connections to service and sacrifice. One message caught Catherine's eye, a photograph of a young soldier in Vietnam, paired with a recent picture of him as a grandfather teaching his grandchildren about service and duty. The caption read, "Some stories can only be told when the wise time is right. Thank you, Sergeant Harrison, for showing us that it's never too late to share what matters." James stood quietly, taking in the scene. His hand rested near his Distinguished Service Cross, but his eyes were on the younger veterans in the room, particularly a group of recently returned soldiers who had been listening intently all evening. One of them, a woman with sergeant stripes and eyes that had seen too much, approached James. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "we've been struggling with our own stories from Afghanistan, wondering if anyone would understand or even want to hear them. Tonight showed us why it matters." The restaurant's chef, who had emerged from the kitchen hours ago and never returned, made his way to James's table. "My grandfather was a child in occupied France," he said softly. "He told me stories of American soldiers sharing their rations, singing songs in the dark. I never understood why those memories moved him to tears until tonight." The chef turned to address the room. "In their honor, I would like to create a special menu. Dishes that tell stories of service, of homeland, of return, simple meals made sacred by the memories they carry." Catherine watched as James's stoic expression softened. She recognized in him what she had often seen in her father, the complex emotion of a warrior finding meaning in peace, of pain transformed into purpose. "Your father," James said to her quietly, "always insisted that remembering wasn't enough. He said we had to do something with our memories, use them to build bridges, to teach, to heal." The historian who had been documenting the evening's events approached their table with tears in her eyes. "What's happening here," she said, "isn't just about war stories or military service. It's about how we honor sacrifice, how we heal as a community, how we ensure that dignity and respect aren't just words, but actions." As the evening deepened, Catherine found herself formulating a vision that would have made her father proud. Standing before the gathered crowd, her voice carried the same quiet authority that had first challenged the maitre d's prejudice hours earlier. "The Montgomery Foundation has always focused on practical support for veterans," she began, her hand resting on the back of James's chair. "But tonight has shown us that there's another kind of support needed, one that honors not just service, but the stories that service creates." The restaurant had become surprisingly quiet, even the kitchen staff pausing in their work to listen. The young Marine who had arrived earlier stood at parade rest near the wall, his presence a bridge between past and present. "I propose we create something new," Catherine continued, "not just a room in a restaurant, though that's where it began, but a program that brings veterans of all eras together with students, historians, and community members. A living library of service and sacrifice." James looked up at her, seeing in her passionate advocacy echoes of her father's leadership. The Distinguished Service Cross caught the light as he shifted in his chair, its gleam a reminder of the cost of the stories they were discussing. "The Montgomery Harrison Initiative," Catherine announced, her voice catching slightly on the names. "A partnership between the foundation and this restaurant, expanding to other venues, other cities, not just collecting stories, but creating connections." The software developer raised his hand. "The app we're developing could be part of this. We could create virtual spaces where veterans can share their experiences, where families can preserve memories, where younger generations can learn directly from those who served." A local school principal who had been dining at the restaurant stood. "Our history curriculum often treats wars as dates and battles. This could make it real for our students, help them understand the human cost, the human courage." The elderly World War II veteran who had shared his story earlier spoke up, his voice trembling but clear. "All these years, I thought no one wanted to hear about the past. Thought it was better to keep quiet, let it fade. But tonight showed me how wrong I was." The Vietnamese chef who had emerged from the kitchen hours ago stepped forward. "In my culture, we have a tradition of ancestor worship, of honoring those who came before. This initiative could be a modern version of that, preserving not just memories, but lessons, wisdom, understanding." Catherine watched as heads nodded throughout the room. The reporter who had first spread word of the evening's events was rapidly taking notes, her face showing she understood she was witnessing the birth of something significant. "We'll need volunteers," Catherine continued, her mind racing with possibilities. "People to record stories, to organize events, to ensure every veteran who wants to share has the opportunity." Hands rose throughout the room. The young couple, who had initially judged James, pledged their technical expertise. The historian offered to create a formal archiving system. The restaurant staff, led by the transformed maitre d', committed to making every Thursday evening a time for veterans to gather and share. James sat quietly through it all, his weathered hands folded on the table. Catherine could see him processing each offer, each suggestion, with the same tactical awareness that had once served him in combat. "Your father," he said finally, his voice carrying in the hushed room, "always said that stories were like ammunition. You had to know when to hold them, when to share them, and how to use them to protect what matters." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "Tonight, I think we've found the right target." The artist who had been sketching all evening turned his tablet toward the crowd. On the screen, he had captured the essence of the proposed initiative, a series of images showing veterans of different eras sharing their stories, their faces illuminated not just by physical light, but by the understanding in the eyes of their listeners. "This isn't just about the past," Catherine concluded, her hand squeezing James's shoulder gently. "It's about ensuring that sacrifice and service are understood, respected, and honored. It's about creating a future where no veteran feels invisible, where no story goes untold, where no act of courage is forgotten." 1 month later, Le Maison Rouge's newly christened Veterans Room was ready for its official opening. The transformation was remarkable. Where once had been generic fine dining decor, now hung carefully curated photographs, medals, and stories. At the center, in a place of honor, was a large black and white photograph of 2 young soldiers in France, Captain Thomas Montgomery and Sergeant James Harrison, standing together before the fateful night that would bind their lives forever. James stood before the photograph, his reflection ghosting over the images of youth and war. He wore a new suit, a gift from the restaurant's tailor who had insisted on crafting it personally after hearing the story. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed on his lapel, no longer hidden but displayed with quiet pride. "It's perfect," Catherine said softly, joining him. She wore her father's own Distinguished Service Cross pinned to her dress, found among his effects after James's story had prompted a deeper search through old boxes. "Though Dad would probably say it's too much fuss." "He would," James agreed, a smile touching his lips. Then he'd stand here for hours, reading every story, learning every name. That's who he was, always more interested in others' courage than his own. The Veterans Room had become something beyond their initial vision. Local veterans had brought in their own mementos, each carefully preserved and displayed with accompanying stories. The walls were equipped with digital screens that cycled through additional photographs and narratives, part of the app that had been developed and launched with surprising speed. The young Marine who had been present that first night was now a regular volunteer, helping older veterans navigate the digital storytelling platform. He stood near the entrance in his dress blues, ready to welcome the evening's guests. "We've had to start a waiting list for Thursday nights," Michel Laurent explained, pride evident in his voice. "Veterans from all over the state want to come, to share, to be part of this." He gestured to the restaurant's main dining room, which had been subtly redesigned to accommodate both regular diners and the weekly veterans' gatherings. The maitre d' Jacques had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation. He now greeted every veteran with genuine respect, learning their names, their service histories, their stories. Tonight he wore a small pin on his lapel, a replica of the resistance medal his grandfather, he had recently discovered, had received for helping Allied soldiers during the occupation. A group of high school students moved through the room, part of the new educational program that had grown from that first evening. They carried tablets recording veteran stories as part of an ongoing oral history project. Their teacher had told Catherine that the program had done more to teach them about courage, sacrifice, and citizenship than any textbook ever could. The park's historian who had witnessed the room's inception now served as its official curator. She moved carefully among the displays, ensuring each item was properly preserved, each story accurately recorded. "What amazes me," she told James, "is how one story leads to another. Each veteran who shares encourages others to break their silence." The Vietnamese chef had created a special menu for the evening, each dish inspired by soldiers' stories, from K-rations transformed into haute cuisine to comfort foods that reminded veterans of home. "Food opens hearts," he explained. "When we share meals, we share memories." Near the room's center, a simple wooden table held a book bound in military-grade canvas. Its pages contained the growing collection of stories, each handwritten by veterans or their families. The software developer had created a digital version, but there was something powerful about the physical act of writing, of seeing the different hands that had recorded their experiences. "Your father would have appreciated this most of all," James said to Catherine, touching the book gently. "Not the medals or photographs, but these words, these testimonies of ordinary people doing extraordinary things." The room had taken on an almost sacred quality in the evening light. The soft illumination caught the medals and photographs, creating an atmosphere that managed to be both honoring and healing. Veterans who entered with tense shoulders and guarded expressions found themselves relaxing, opening up, sharing stories they had carried alone for too long. Catherine watched as an elderly veteran showed his grandchildren the exact model of radio he had used in Korea, now preserved behind glass. The children's eyes were wide with interest, not just in the equipment, but in their grandfather's story, perhaps hearing it for the first time. The success of the Veterans Room sparked a movement that spread far beyond La Maison Rouge's elegant walls. Within months, similar spaces began appearing in restaurants and community centers across the country. The Montgomery Harrison Initiative had touched a nerve in the national consciousness, reminding people that every community had its heroes, every family its stories of service and sacrifice. James found himself busier than he'd been in years. 3 times a week, he visited local schools with other veterans, sharing their experiences with students who had only known war through textbooks and movies. The children's questions often surprised him with their depth and empathy. "Were you scared?" a young girl asked one day, her eyes serious behind pink-framed glasses. "Every day," James had answered honestly. But being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done anyway. He saw heads nodding throughout the classroom and noticed the teacher wiping away tears. Catherine had expanded her father's foundation, creating a network that connected veterans not just with resources, but with each other. The digital platform that had started as a simple app had grown into a comprehensive system for preserving and sharing military experiences across generations. The young couple who had initially judged James by his appearance had become two of the initiative's most dedicated volunteers. Their tech expertise, combined with their genuine remorse over their earlier prejudice, drove them to ensure that every veteran's story was captured with dignity and respect. It's not just about recording history, the software developer explained during a national conference on veteran affairs. It's about creating connections, building bridges between generations, helping people understand the true cost and meaning of service. The restaurant's Veterans Room had become a model for similar spaces nationwide. Local historians and curators regularly visited to learn how to create their own memorial spaces that felt alive rather than museum-like, that encouraged interaction rather than silent observation. One Thursday evening, as James sat at what had become his regular table, he watched a scene that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. A young Afghan war veteran was sharing her experiences with a Vietnam vet, while a Gulf War Marine added his perspective. Their different eras and conflicts melted away as they found common ground in their shared service. "You know what amazes me," the Afghan vet said, gesturing around the room. "How something like this grew from one simple act of kindness. You being invited to dinner that night." James shook his head slowly. "It grew from something deeper than that. It grew from a promise made in a burning farmhouse in France, and from Catherine's understanding of what that promise meant." The Vietnamese chef, who had become famous for his veterans menu, emerged from the kitchen with a special dish, his interpretation of combat rations transformed into haute cuisine. "For those who served," he said simply, placing it before them. The Maitre de Jacques no longer needed to be reminded to treat veterans with respect. He had become one of the program's most passionate advocates, often spending his free time helping older veterans arrange transportation to the weekly gatherings. A local artists collective had begun contributing their talents, creating portraits of veterans that captured not just their appearance, but their stories. The walls of the Veterans Room now held dozens of these works, each accompanied by a narrative that helped viewers understand the person behind the uniform. "My father would never have imagined this," Catherine told James one evening, watching as a group of teenagers interviewed a retired nurse about her service in Desert Storm. He thought his story would die with him. Instead, it helped create all of this. James nodded, his hand unconsciously touching the Distinguished Service Cross that he now wore openly. "Tom always said that the true measure of a soldier isn't what he does in battle, but what he does with the life he's given afterward." I think he'd be proud to see how his story, our story, has helped others find their voice. The historian who had documented everything since that first night approached their table carrying a leather-bound volume. "The first printing," she said, placing it before them. The book's title read, "Beyond the Battlefield, the Montgomery Harrison Initiative, and the Stories That Heal." 6 months after that fateful evening, La Maison Rouge hosted a special dinner to commemorate the impact of the Montgomery Harrison Initiative. James arrived early, wearing the suit that had been tailored for him, his Distinguished Service Cross gleaming in the soft light. This time, when he approached the entrance, Jacques rushed to open the door with genuine warmth. The restaurant had been transformed for the occasion. Each table held a small electronic frame, cycling through veterans' photographs and stories. The elegant centerpieces incorporated elements of military service, small American flags, carefully preserved letters, dog tags, donated by families wanting to be part of the memorial. Catherine stood at the podium, her father's Distinguished Service Cross pinned to her dress as always. The room was filled with an extraordinary mix of people, veterans from every era, students who had participated in the Oral History Project, community leaders who had helped spread the initiative across the country, and regular diners who had become part of the extended family of supporters. 6 months ago, Catherine began, a brave man came to this restaurant to honor a promise and a memory. He thought he would be turned away because of his worn jacket and humble demeanor. Instead, his courage in sharing his story helped us all understand what true worth looks like. James sat at the table of honor, surrounded by veterans, young and old. The young Marine who had been present that first night was now the initiative's military liaison, helping coordinate with active duty units to ensure current service members knew they would always have a place to share their stories. The Montgomery Harrison Initiative has now collected over 10,000 stories, Catherine continued, but more importantly, it has created countless connections. Veterans who thought their experiences would die with them have found new purpose in sharing. Families who never knew their loved ones' full stories have discovered the depth of their sacrifice. Young people who only knew war through movies have learned what service and honor truly mean. The Vietnamese chef had outdone himself for the evening, creating a menu that told its own story of military service and sacrifice. Each dish was accompanied by a card explaining its significance, from a refined version of D-Day rations to a dessert inspired by the cookies military mothers sent to their children overseas. But perhaps the most remarkable outcome, Catherine said, her voice softening, has been the healing. Veterans who had kept their memories locked away for decades have found peace in sharing. Young soldiers struggling with recent deployments have found understanding from those who walked similar paths. Families have found closure in finally hearing the stories their loved ones carried. James stood slowly, making his way to the podium at Catherine's gesture. The room fell silent, every eye on the man whose quiet dignity had sparked this movement. Your father, he began, addressing Catherine, but speaking to the entire room, once told me that the hardest part of war isn't the fighting, it's carrying the memories afterward. He was right, but he was also wrong. The hardest part isn't carrying the memories, it's carrying them alone. He touched the Distinguished Service Cross on his lapel. This medal was awarded for one night of courage in France. But I have seen more courage in this room over the past 6 months. Courage in sharing painful memories, in listening with understanding, in reaching across generations to ensure that service and sacrifice are never forgotten. The elderly World War II veteran who had shared his story that first night raised his glass in a toast. Others followed suit, the gesture spreading through the room like a wave. To absent friends, the old veteran called out, his voice strong. Despite his years, to absent friends, the room echoed. Catherine watched as James returned to his seat, noting how his shoulders no longer carried the weight they had 6 months ago. The promise he had made to her father in a burning French farmhouse had been more than fulfilled. It had grown into something that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. As the evening drew to a close, a young soldier recently returned from overseas approached James. "Sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been carrying something I thought no one would understand. But being here, hearing these stories, I think I'm ready to share mine." James gestured to the chair beside him, his eyes gentle with understanding. "Pull up a seat, soldier," he said softly. "Tell me your story." And in that moment, as another story began to unfold, the spirit of Thomas Montgomery and all those who had served with honor and dignity lived on in the sharing, in the understanding, and in the healing that comes when no veteran has to carry their memories alone. The Distinguished Service Cross on James's lapel caught the light one final time, its gleam a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when we choose to share our truth with others.